I'm Sarah Reske. I'm an anthropologist here in the ILR school at Cornell, for those of you who don't know me. And it's my just great pleasure to be able to introduce Nanika Mathur and welcome her to the South Asia program today. Nanika is an associate professor in the anthropology of South Asia at the University of Oxford. Before coming to Oxford, Nanika took a BA and an MA from the University of Delhi and an MPhil and PhD from Cambridge, and also held postdoctoral fellowships with the Leverhulme Trust and the British Academy. Nanika's work spans multiple fields of both disciplinary and interdisciplinary concern, from political anthropology to development studies to questions of law, the environment, climate change, and human-animal relations. Nanika's first book, Paper Tiger, Law, Bureaucracy, and the Development State in Himalayan India, was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. The book won the very kind of prestigious and incredibly important prize, the Sharon Stevens Prize from the American Ethnological Society. The book traces the translation of two widely commended laws and their translation into practice through an ethnography of quotidian bureaucratic life. Paper Tiger rejects standard explanations for development or state failure in India, with those failures being rooted in inefficiency, in incapacity, dysfunctionality, corruption, or violence. And the book instead presents an alternative narrative, but an alternatively ethnographically driven, ethnographically astute reconceptualization of the development state. Importantly, the book highlights the counterintuitive effects of the push for transparency as a kind of developmentalist buzzword in the functioning of the post-liberalization Indian state. And Nayanika's second book, which has kind of brought us all here in virtual space today, was just published in 2021 by the University of Chicago Press. And Crooked Cats, Beastly Encounters in the Anthropocene, rethinks and retells the story of big cats that make prey on humans in India, by centering these narratives, these stories, in these encounters between humans and animals in climate crisis. The book, as we'll hear a lot more about, weaves together beastly tales spun from long-term fieldwork in India in order to, again, in a kind of similar vein to the Paper Tiger, rethink our understanding, our kind of normative understandings of the causes, consequences, as well as our very conceptualization of climate crisis today. And so I'll kind of leave the description of Crooked Cats at that to kind of cede more time to hear Nanika speak about it. But I wanted to also note just one last thing that will be of interest to many folks on the call today, and especially with some of the ongoing research work that's going on at South Asia program. Nanika is currently building on questions that arise from this recent book in new and ongoing work that asks what climate crisis does to the production of knowledge, not only in anthropology specifically, but in the humanities and social sciences more broadly. These are methodological and empirical questions that are bringing folks at Oxford together through the climate crisis thinking in the humanities and social science group that Nayanika also co-directs. And so with that, please welcome me in the anticlimactic Zoom clap. And we thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing about your work.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that really generous and wonderful introduction. Thank you so much to the South Asia program for inviting me to Cornell virtually. It's quite exciting to be here. And thank you all for being here today. I'm going to, as Sarah said, I'm going to very quickly, sort of in the half an hour or I have, or 35 minutes perhaps, I'm going to quickly run through some of the main arguments of my new book, Crooked Cats, which Sarah has just described. And then I was sort of debating between presenting one chapter, one article from it, or the book, but I think I'd like to just talk about the book so that you can get a flavor of some of the overarching arguments that this work is dealing with. Before I do so, let me sort of go, I think to sort of locate where this book comes from, I think it's quite important for me to sort of go back to the origin story, so to say, of this work. And this actually began back in 2006 when I just started my PhD, when I was doing fieldwork in Uttarakhand in northern India. As most of you know, it's a Himalayan state there. I was then working in, I was living and working in this district called Chamoli, which has a border with Tibet and is sort of close to Nepal. And I was at the time, exactly as Sarah described, I was at the time looking at sort of everyday bureaucracy. I was sort of doing fieldwork within government offices in Chamoli. I was then based out of a small town called Gopeshwar, and basically this man-eating leopard turned up there. A few weeks after I arrived in Gopeshwar myself, it went on to sort of spread this reign of terror, killed at least 6 to 7 humans, injured many more. It was sort of this terrifying sort of experience before the leopard herself was killed, was hunted down by this local shikari hunter called Mr. Lakpat Singh Rawat, and then her corpse was sort of paraded around the town as evidence of the death of this man-eater. Now, at the time, this sort of book had, this big cat, this particular leopard, had a walk-on part in the first book, which Sarah sort of mentioned, Paper Tiger, that resulted from this research, most strikingly in the conceiving of the book title and in the final chapter on bureaucratic temporalities and the failure of law. In this work, I had considered the question of why do strongly protectionist laws that aim to conserve endangered non-human animals like big cats not work? And what I did was I used the case of that man-eating leopard to make two arguments. One was that the draconian nature of India's wildlife protection regimes, particularly as manifested in the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, is too stringent, and it ends up slowing bureaucratic state processes to such an extent that it leads to intense animosity amongst citizens, leading them to claim that the Indian state only cares for the lives of tigers and leopards and not certain types of marginalized citizens, such as the Paharis or the mountain people I worked with. This antagonism hinders conservation in a range of ways and can be directly traced to the legal and bureaucratic practices that are built around charismatic megafauna. Anyway, at the time, I thought that I was done with the story of crooked cats, though I did continue to sort of interview victims of attacks, and I maintained fieldwork notes on sort of the presence of what I call crooked cats. And I'll just explain in a second why I call them crooked cats and not man-eaters in Uttarakhand. And I sort of also did quite a bit of archival work in some districts trying to figure out what kind of state records are kept on them. And I sort of thought I was done with the story of big cats. I sort of moved on to other projects which are related very much to the nature of the Indian state, to the nature of law and bureaucracy. In 2015, I returned for an extended fieldwork stint in Uttarakhand, and this time I was based in the North Indian state of Dehradun, which is the capital city of Uttarakhand. And, I was working on something completely different for this period of fieldwork, but I sort of got there, and within weeks of my arrival, a young woman was killed and devoured by a leopard just down the road from where I was living. And this was at what's called the Forest Research Institute. And again, maybe we can discuss it a bit in the Q&A, but what happened with this sort of this beastly encounter, so to say, was that it was very much a sort of uncanny mirroring of what had happened almost a decade back when I was living in Gopeshwar, where this leopard suddenly turns up, it kills a young woman. In the Gopeshwar case, in the first instance, the leopard had not killed the woman, had just had very, very badly injured her. But it was sort of uncanny the ways in which this sort of mirrored what had happened at that time. Of course, the difference was that this time, instead of being a small, remote Himalayan town on India's borderland, this was happening in the sprawling capital city of the state, in the plains and within the bounds of the Forest Research Institute, which is an institution that was central to the birth of scientific forestry in India in the 19th century. And so basically, FRI sort of, Dehradun reverberated with the shock of this killing. There was a proliferation of big cat talk or buck talk. And once again, I was pulled back into the world of crooked cats. And so basically, this is in a way why I sort of went back to studying human big cat relations. It was sort of both times, it was sort of very serendipitous, and I was pulled into it almost just by virtue of being in the state of Uttarakhand. And this time I really sort of just started focusing on this, and that's where this book comes from. Now, onto the actual book, and what are some of the strands of sort of thinking and argumentation in this work, and what am I trying to do with it? I'm going to talk about all of these very quickly for the rest of the talk. But very quickly, one of my big objectives with this work is to move away from two dominant modes of telling the story of predatory big cats or of man-eaters. And I'll just explain what those two dominant modes are. I'm also very interested in thinking about how we tell stories. So what is the ethnographic project in this moment if we take the climate crisis seriously and if we are wanting to write the climate crisis into our work? Exactly as Sarah said, this is actually exactly where my current research is and my future research. And I've been running this little network here, which is also interested in this, but this comes very directly out of this book. I explore in the book the productive nature, perhaps. I mean, I'm very open to thinking maybe it's not productive, but I think I kind of make an argument here for framing this work through the concept of the Anthropocene. And I will explain how I use the Anthropocene, why I use it, and how I think it might be productive. Something that comes through in this book all through is this aspect of uncertainty. And I will again explain what I mean by uncertainty and in what ways does uncertainty come out in this work and why does that sort of become, in a way, the defining flavor of the book, so to say. The chapters are divided into two sections. One is really focused again on governance. As I said, that's what I was initially interested in, and that interest in the local state, in regimes of government, in regimes of law, and the kind of bureaucratic labor that goes into running the state is something that I just can't seem to get away from. And I center that quite importantly in this work. And then I discuss this concept of beastly intimacy, which is more in relation, in conversation with some of the more multi-species ethnographic work that's out there, which is trying to understand how do humans and non-humans come to share space, how do they come to know each other, how do they come to have sort of, deep relations with one another. And then, of course, the point of ethnographic methods, which is sort of an overarching point of this work. So let me sort of talk about the two dominant modes through which the story of predatory big cats is largely told. One is, of course, through the colonial shikari, through these shikar narratives, some of which are extremely popular, such as, I'm sure many of you have heard of, if not read, Jim Corbett's work. Jim Corbett was this hunter who then became a conservationist towards the latter part of his life. And he's written these very thrilling stories of his encounters with man-eaters in the very same region, in Uttarakhand largely. And it's all about how, these heroic narratives of hunting them down and saving these terrified villagers from the reign of terror of big cats. In a way, it's sort of easy to criticize Corbett, but I'm more interested in thinking about what the impact of someone like Corbett has been on contemporary regimes of government, contemporary cultures of the state, in the ways in which hunters today model themselves on Corbett, the ways in which they take on his dress, the deportment, the narratives, the stories, how they sort of continue to be really really within the same mold that Corbett was setting out in these extremely popular books of his. So that's something I talk about, and I want to break from that way of telling the story. Perhaps a bit more controversially, a bit more surprisingly, maybe, I'm also sort of very uncomfortable with the conservationist accounts, which proliferate, especially when it comes to big cats, especially when it comes to tigers. But most of my work is with leopards, though I do also, some of the work also looks at tigers and lions in this book. But it's perhaps important to say here that tigers, lions, and leopards are legally considered, they fall under the same schedule of protection, and they have the same level of protection as endangered animals under the Indian Constitution, which gives them, which leads to very similar kinds of processes through which the state deals with them, for instance. And part of my sort of real attempt here is to break with that and try to think about other ways to tell the story. Now, how does one do this? Let me sort of perhaps talk about the title of the book and why I refer to these big cats as crooked cats rather than as man-eaters or just big cats. So right from the very start, I was quite uncomfortable with the term man-eater. For obviously, it's so sexist because it uses man rather than human. But beyond that, I was also found the colonial origin of the term, as well as the manner in which both the state, the post-colonial state, and conservationist agencies deploy it somewhat problematic. As I said, I'm trying to break from these colonial conservationist positions on big cats, and I found that using the term sort of didn't really help me do that. I also found that, the term man-eater doesn't entirely square up to, it's sort of unsuitable with the kind of stories that people tell, the words they use, the narratives they use to describe what it is like to share space with big cats that might be predatory. What is it to live with we're hearing a lot about living with coronavirus right now, but I've been hearing for the longest time about living with Adam Korbag or living with, so-called man-eaters. How does one sort of do that? Now, one of the ways in which the presence of such big cats was explained to me in the mountains was through the description as departing from the straight and narrow path to become, for some very inexplicable reasons, crooked. And so, I was told in Uttarakhand that there are two types of big cats. There are those that are Siddha Sada, there's like sort of straightforward, simple cats, and they're as scared of humans as we are of them, if not more, right? So normally these cats, these Siddha cats, which are the vast majority of big cats, if they see humans, they will do the best to avoid them. They will go out of the way to hide from them. They will not, they will not actually attack them unprovoked, etc. And this is the vast majority of such big cats. But the problem lies with those big cats that have gone off the straight and narrow path to become teda, quote unquote, crooked. And this crookedness is what leads them to disrupt the peaceful coexistence that otherwise prevails between humans and big cats. Now, the question is, what is it that makes a big cat go crooked? Why, and how do we, why is it that only that cat goes crooked and might be like 7 more in the same area, but they're totally fine? What is it about that individual? And also, how do we humans come to recognize and intimately know a crooked cat? How does one live besides such beasts? And what might all of this have to do with the climate crisis and with life in the Anthropocene? Or perhaps even more perplexingly, with disciplinary boundaries, methodologies, and the question of how academic writing intervenes in the world. These are the questions that this book delves into, and the term crooked cat allows for. And hence, I prefer to use this term, and I think it allows me to make certain claims. It allows me to tell the story in a particular way. It allows me to describe relationships between humans and big cats in perhaps through different narrative accounts than the ones that colonial statist or conservationist discourse might allow us to do. And that's why this whole thing of, what I call beastly tales, which is, of course, a term that I borrow from the writer Vikram Seth, who has this very beautiful set of, collection of poetry called Beastly Tales from Here and There. And this is where I get the term from. And I think this term sort of allows me to really ask the question of who is the real beast of the story. It allows me to sort of center storytelling in the climate crisis. It also allows you to sort of, weave together different kinds of beasts, so human and non-human beasts of all types, and put them within the same sort of story, so to say, within the same narrative. Okay, now I should sort of, I sort of used Anthropocene quite a bit in this book, and the book is framed by the concept of the Anthropocene, and I want to sort of, again, I'm sure all of you know this, there are very different ways in which the Anthropocene is being used, not just across disciplinary boundaries. So, geologists would use it quite differently from an anthropologist, but say even within anthropology or within South Asian studies or within history, there have been many different ways in which people have picked up the concept of the Anthropocene. And I want to just dwell for a few minutes on how I use it and why I think the Anthropocene might be a productive framing. So again, as all of you know, the Anthropocene is a term that has been coined by geologists to signify the epoch subsequent to the Holocene, in which human actions are shaping the planet so profoundly that they're now acting as a geological force. There are debates about when the Anthropocene really began, but it is widely now agreed that this is the current age that we're living in. Now, climate change is also widely accepted to be anthropogenic in nature, that is, it's caused by humans. The difference between climate change and Anthropocene is nicely captured by the historian Julie Adney Thomas, where she describes the Anthropocene as a multi-dimensional predicament that needs to be navigated through the deployment of new ways of thinking. Climate change is a product of the Anthropocene, but it is not fully encapsulated by it, and it would be dangerous to conflate the two. I utilize the Anthropocene throughout this book to refer to the critical requirement of finding new ways of thinking and of doing academic labor. I work from the premise that the Anthropocene signifies a political and ethical imperative to act on the world with a new urgency, and to do so requires the weaving together of stories and elements of social, ecological, biological, historical, and political life that have been hitherto kept apart. This is not the same challenge as the one that the long-standing issue of interdisciplinarity is posed, but is a somewhat different animal, so to say, due to the need to write in a new geological epoch and its potentially apocalyptic effects for life, human and otherwise, on Earth. Human-animal relationships the world over are being profoundly shaped and changed by the ecological breakdown. So many of the central themes of crooked cats, such as the bewildering rise in attacks on humans by cats, the changing behavior of big cats that is being captured on cameras and televisions and is widely and is an evidence in acts such as the increasing entry into urban, heavily populated sites, imminent species extinction with the tiger in a particularly vulnerable position, human anger at and struggles with conservationism are all intimately linked to a changing planet. In that sense, the climate crisis enters empirically as a fact that can no longer be turned away from and is an urgent need of acknowledgement. But the question is, how do we write the climate crisis into our accounts of a seemingly tiny issue of big cats that make prey of humans in India? And now this is really like a huge ambition and methodological challenge of the book. I argue that it entails a questioning of long-standing methods or modes of describing the world. It requires a transformation in how we narrate the story of human-animal relationships, as well as the plotline and who or what the main protagonists are. This new form of storytelling also requires that we have what can perhaps be called an agnostic stance towards disciplinary boundedness or subfields, such as say environmental anthropology or wildlife history or more than human geography. So I think it's not enough to say that I do multi-species ethnography. I think that there are sort of ways in which certain kinds of relationships have to be forged across these disciplinary and subdisciplinary boundaries. And again, that's incredibly hard to do, and that's something that I hope to sort of take forward in my future work, in my current work. Now, the beastly tales I sort of relate in this book initially perplexed me for one reason. When a crooked cat was in the vicinity, most people wanted him or her killed or captured at the earliest. Oftentimes, a preference was expressed for the death of the crooked cat, which would assuage collective anger, but also ensure that the cat wouldn't eventually escape and return to once again haunt the area with an even greater vengeance. At the very same time, a sympathetic stance towards the big cat was professed. The big cat was referred to as a bichara, a poor thing, a bekasur, innocent. I argue that these two contradicting narratives on crooked cats can coexist because the people who live in close proximity to them are conscious that the crookedness is not the doing of the individual feline, but rather emerges from longer-term structures in human actions. In the heat of the terrified moment, they wish to do away with the individual, but are aware that the blame lies on the doorsteps of quote-unquote us humans. Of course, the category of humans is parsed out carefully. There are several types of specified humans who are singled out as responsible for this horrific state of affairs. There is no undifferentiated we of humankind invoked here. Rather, there's a clear understanding of power and social stratification along lines of caste, class, gender, age, location, and race. Climate change, as has been well argued by now, is notoriously hard to pin down to just one thing, to clearly see and to articulate coherently. And there is great difficulty too in making the complex interconnections across time and scale that then allow it to be brought into visibility. It is also hard to clearly identify who all are responsible for this crisis, giving the gesturing to vastly depersonalized systems like capitalism or consumerism. So a central claim of my book is that the stories of crooked cats recounted here do this intellectual work of pulling together disparate elements that allow us to experience and fathom the climate crisis in a unique way. But this requires a receptiveness to the message in the beastly tales, a willingness to trace the connections that explain our current planetary predicament through the peculiar phenomena of big cats that make prey of humans in India. So almost all my interlocutors, ranging from conservationists to residents of the Himalaya to hunters, claim that there is a massive spike in the unusual actions and visits of big cats in recent times. To chart this out statistically is difficult due to the unreliability or absence of data for all of India over the long durée. Mapping this out also involves relying on a particular form of knowledge, which is the quantitative or the statistical, as a mode of persuasion. So, an ambition here is to instead rely on the beastly tales to do this labor of convincing for us. I take very seriously the universal claim among my interlocutors that big cats are acting in ways that are increasingly considered out of character. For instance, in Uttarakhand, again, to go back to my field site, this has the highest number of attacks on humans by leopards and tigers in India and actually in the world. And this claim is widely accepted. Every time I go back to Uttarakhand, all I hear are stories about this leopard attack here, it did this, it did that, this tiger is going rogue in this area, etc. And it's sort of not possible to turn away from this and somehow say that this is not not somehow linked to the ecological collapse that is also very evident in this region, or to the climate disasters that we're seeing again and again. Every year there's almost some new climate disaster. There's all the time something happening over there. And I found it a bit perplexing in the ways in which these stories are sort of kept separate from that wider world within which we're living, as well as the wider politics that are imbuing the state. And something that I want to do is sort of weave them together. I should also say that, when I first started working this, there was a lot of, and there still is a lot of resistance to the centering of the climate crisis, right? Because somehow there is this belief in certain fields or certain academic positions that to center it, you are reducing everything down to something like climate change. And actually, one of the things over here is to actually say that climate change is formed by these political, social, historical aspects that we otherwise have been focusing on, and how do we sort of weave that together into this. Another thing that is sort of very, which has really sort of pushed things over here is this narrative of uncertainty, right? And the ways in which there's been a lot of uncertain knowledge forms that surround all of these, right? And I'm going to just talk about what this uncertainty is doing before I just sort of take another 5-10 minutes to just sort of finish up here. Now, there are several theories on the existence of crooked cats, and there are also many speculations on why they're acting thus, which I sort of explore in some detail. It is difficult, and as I ultimately argue, unnecessary to separate out these various theories to claim that there is a singular explanation for why non-human animals are considering to be more violent than before. There are many unknowns in the story of crooked cats. In fact, this book was birthed out of the uncertainty that characterizes the presence and spread of crooked cats. There was uncertainty around why cats become crooked. Are they crooked? What are they doing? Where is this coming from, etc., is what leads to this dense proliferation of beastly tales. And that uncertainty actually is, that in a way, at the heart of this, that you're constantly speculating, you're constantly questioning, you're constantly asking things, you're putting out theories, you're thinking of individuals, you're putting out individual biographies, whether this is of a human or a big cat. And there's a very sort of speculative knowledge formation that is going on here. There's also like a very long history to this. So there's a lot of wonderful animal history that is actually looked at big cats and and the relation to humans, as well as man-eaters. There is also a lot of sort of work which is happening in behavioral sciences and zoology, etc., where they're looking at where they really study big cats. And again, given the nature and the charismatic nature of these megafauna, there's a lot of funding that goes into studying tigers, big cats, tigers, lions, and leopards. But yet there is something about them that leaves them, to be largely unknowable and unpredictable. And this, to me, perhaps one of the things that I might find most sort of fascinating over here in the story is that there is this uncertainty and this unpredictability to it. And yet the state and conservationist agencies have to behave as if they're certain, as if they have certain knowledge, as if there are particular ways in which you can understand these beasts and what's happening, and as if you can follow these unbending rule books that the state has sort of put out there, conservationism is sort of forcing them to do. This acting with certainty in the face of something that remains relatively unknown is a conundrum that lies at the very heart of what I term the government of big cats. And the government of big cats is a central theme of this book. So as Anne Kelly, etc., have noticed, ignorance and uncertainty never describe a generic absence of knowledge, but always refer to highly specific forms of unknowing. So this book depicts several forms of unknowing around crooked cats and the means through which concerned humans attempt to arrive at greater certainty. So when I refer to uncertainty and unknowns, it isn't to depict my interlocutors as ignorant or somehow lacking. Rather, it is to highlight the tentative, affective, and situational knowledges that are in operation. It is also to highlight how formal institutions of governance and conservation refuse to acknowledge the fact that they in truth function through such uncertain knowledge practices, yet demand, and more often than not, work to actively manufacture legible knowns. Now, again, something that I'm not going to have time to go into, but there is a sort of a huge amount of sort of literature which is now coming out from the natural sciences that shows that, say, anthropogenic climate change is central to species extinction, that shows that, we're in what's being termed the sixth mass extinction, that shows that the ecological collapse is leading to all sorts of, responses in non-human animals. And actually what's been interesting in the last few years is that you can even see it in newspapers, right? Where you have those polar bears attacking the Siberian town, where you have these stories of these leopards walking around in Bangalore or in Gurgaon in India, where you have this, like, these animals are behaving, these bears which are acting in unpredictable ways. There's a whole way in which it's also entering public consciousness in ways that somehow the natural science work was also talking about. And what I want to do here is actually not allow one particular kind of knowledge form to dominate this, but actually try to see how can ethnographic work, which is speculative in nature, which is sort of putting out what I call informed musings, can be integrated into some of this science literature or into some of the historical literature to be able to center ethnographic storytelling of a different type, without feeling sort of a bit embarrassed about the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty around this. That there is that actually this kind, without feeling this pressure, which I felt, for instance, to produce an overarching authoritative explanatory narrative that is oftentimes expected of academic writing. Right. And I felt like in the beginning, when I was sort of doing this, I thought that I wasn't able to get that kind of authoritative certain knowledge because of the nature of my fieldwork, where I did fieldwork in 2006 to 2008, then I went 2015 to 2016. I've been sort of in and out of India, being, and worked in different parts of India, seen very different case studies, etc. But actually, the more I sort of worked through it and worked through my field notes or worked through some of the other kinds of the geography literature, the natural science literature in it, you see that it is actually a very sort of, this is how they are discussed. Like, this is actually the very nature of the knowledge form around it. And so, so I want to sort of center this in this book. And in a way, if you think of what is it about the Anthropocene, I think, or of this current moment that we're living through, whether it's through the pandemic or it's sort of the lurch to the right that we're seeing in global politics, especially in India, for instance, you can see that there's this profound uncertainty, which is the defining condition of our times. So perhaps it's not that surprising that this is also sort of something that is visible on every page of this book, even as it tries to make some pretty strong claims. Again, I'm going to sort of end here because I'm sort of running out of time, but very quickly, the book is divided into two parts, as I said. The first part is really looking at the government of big cats, where I center governance structures and cultures, and I sort of center quotidian bureaucratic labor. I also actually do a lot of, like, I'm really interested in looking at the colonial culture of the state, or like the ways in which the colonial state's culture of governance remains on today, not just within local bureaucrats, but also within shikaris, within hunters, within conservationists, and in other narratives around big cats. I'm very interested in, again, in the Wildlife Protection Acts. I'm very interested in sort of the ways in which conservationist agencies are working through them, etc. What I try to do if I had to say, the one thing I want to really push through with the narrative in the government of big cats is that I think it is untenable to separate out certain domains, such as the climatic from the political. And something that you can see in the literature is that somehow this everyday bureaucratic work, this grumbling about corruption, these, little paper things that I was so obsessed with in my first book, with documents, etc., ID cards or bureaucratic practices, are somehow seen as completely separate from something like the climate change or, like, the Anthropocene, that these are not things that interrelate. This is just something. And something I try to do here, I hope, I don't know how successful I am, but I try to put them in the same plane of analysis and say that you can't actually separate them out. And similarly so with sort of some of the historical literature, where again, there's a long tradition of studying the colonial state and the post-colonial state and thinking about, continuity or rupture. I try to sort of think about the ways in which some of those aspects of it continue on, especially when it comes to the government of protected species like tigers and leopards. The other thing I'm really interested in is in how do we come to, like, you don't really see tigers or leopards so much, right? Even though they're around. So how do humans come to develop emotions for use of big cats? And in this, I center space. So I've done fieldwork in very different parts of India, and I've sort of wanted to center that through focus on cities. So I've done fieldwork in Shimla, Dehradun, and Bombay. And I centered like the urban quite a lot in this. I'm also really interested in the ways through which we see big cats. So I have a chapter on on CCTV cameras and WhatsApp, and the ways in which visuals of big cats circulate and what that does to our understanding of them. So how is it that we actually come to profess an intimate relationship with them is through these new ways of seeing big cats. I also, after every 2 chapters, I have what I call a beastly biography, which is I focus on the life and death of a particular, well, they're not all dead, but I focus on the lives of certain celebrity big cats, including, for instance, Kipling's Sher Khan and Jim Corbett's man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag, but also less famous ones such as local leopards or tigers who are quite famous. Because again, I'm so obsessed with this question of what is the future of ethnography in this moment and in the future in terms of, within the climate crisis, that I'm sort of very interested in thinking about other ways in which we tell stories or we write, while we drop on the strengths of ethnography, which is its, deep engagement with space, with the textured storytelling, with these, with this, with the sensitivity to the everyday. And so something that I found really interesting, I think is a productive way of doing that is by telling stories of individual big cats, and sort of tracing the lives and thinking about the ways that they talked about as also one way to sort of put ethnography front and center. So yeah, so I'm sort of going to end here. Thank you so much for listening to me and for bearing with this, this whistle stop tour through this book. And thank you so much again for having me here. I look forward to talking to all of you.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. Anticlimactic Zoom clap. I will clap on behalf of all of us. That was, just really, really exciting and also really just generative for, kind of thinking about the relationship between ethnographic methods and climate change. So we have, for me, that's just me personally, I'm just totally my brain is on fire. So we have ample time for questions. So, and so please feel free to use your hand icon in Zoom, and I will start a queue. You're welcome to use the chat function if you find that preferable, and I will try to kind of, link them together. And I of course could ask questions for the entire time. So great. So I see Parijat's hand, so I'm going to just, so Parijat, do you want to, and then, oh great, we have a queue starting. So Parijat, do you want to take it away? We can't hear you. Totally not.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I'm outside. I'm walking to class, so I apologize for kind of catching you in transit. But I was really interested by your discussion of ethnography and what ethnography can do and can be in this moment. And in a previous discussion of your book, you had talked about this little boy who had developed a really close relationship with a particular cat, and I found it really interesting. And something I was wondering is how does the ethnographic record kind of establish to some extent what relationship already we can conceive of with big cats or of the Himalayas, and how does ethnography or anthropology already kind of build its conceptions of big cats and of what's conceivable of big cats through this ethnographic record, and is it important for the future ongoing ethnographic work to kind of challenge that ethnographic record itself?
Thanks, Parijat. That's a really great question. Should I answer straight away, Sarah? Or do you? Yep.
So, yeah, so one and one and one and one until,
okay.
and then at the end, if we can collect some if necessary.
Okay, brilliant. So Parijat, thanks a lot for that question. I think the thing is that, it's such an interesting question in terms of, I really like the way you particularly ended, where you say that, do we also challenge some of the ethnographic record itself? And I think part of my, so it's sort of this weird ambivalent relationship one has with a discipline or a particular knowledge form, right? Where I think that anthropology and ethnography is so important. And for me, it's still the primary way through which I make sense of the world. And I think it opens out something that's very powerful. But I also feel when it comes to some of the multi-species ethnographic work, or it comes to some of the ways, and not just multi-species ethnography, I think some of the work, say on the state, including my own work on it, for instance, I feel there are ways in which I'm getting increasingly uncomfortable with the bounding work that sort of goes on there, the ways in which we sort of have to say that, well, this is the world I'm looking at, and that's all that I'm looking at. And I will bound this off from, for instance, I will bound the study of this big cat that was that never hurt anyone, but was sort of lurking in this village in a particular way from, say, wider questions of what does it mean to belong, or questions of caste or of gender. I mean, I feel like for me, I'm sort of uncomfortable with the ways in which, for instance, in this particular work, the climate crisis there's so much resistance to it. So even if I think, say, of the reviews that this book got in the beginning, I can't tell you, all the reviewers were like, but what does climate change have to do with man-eaters? India has always had man-eaters. Like, there have always been tigers, which this is India almost, right? I mean, I know who this one particularly Orientalist like review was like, but what is this? I don't understand this whole Anthropocene thing. Is it just a trendy thing that, that you're getting onto? And why is there so much interest in like journals from Nature and what Nature, what these studies are saying, etc. And so I felt like, I mean, that's not about ethnography, but I think it's more about the ways and the kind of conversations ethnography is allowed to have with outside the social science and across, outside even anthropology. So not just, say, with biology or zoology, but I feel like there's something in that bounding work, which is also something that perhaps some of us, whether we are students or not, or whatever stage of your career at, from the looks of it, we feel like we need to perform that, and I feel like that's something that I'm uncomfortable with. But at the same time, I think ethnography is so powerful in terms, like, the Malinowskian ethnography almost is so powerful in the way in which it allows us to describe the world. And in this, so it's sort of this ambivalent relationship I have with it. And I'm sort of interested in exploring my future work, not so much with Crooked Cats, but something I'm really interested in exploring my future work is actually, how do you keep ethnographic storytelling at the heart of your intellectual endeavor, even as you give much more importance, or you take on other knowledge forms more seriously. And I think that that's a very hard thing to do, and I've been struggling with it. But this is really my project for the next few years, in a way, for the foreseeable future, so to say, actually. So I don't know if this answers your question. It's a really good question. It's a really important question, and thank you so much for it. But yeah, just to say that this is something that I've been sort of wrestling with as well, and something I want to sort of take forward. Thanks, Parijat. I hope you get to class on time.
That's really fabulous and super generative. Mahesh, do you have a question?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, Pranam, Dr. Mathur. Myself, Mahesh from Shepherd of Himalayas.
Mm-hmm.
I am working with Parsi shepherds in Chamoli district from last 4 years.
Oh, wow.
Documenting. Yeah, I'm working in your field side actually. I'm actually collecting oral narratives between their interaction with leopards, and I'm trying to identify the various factors that are negatively as well as positively impacting their interactions,
right,
and how they ultimately going to relate it. So what I found is that identity of leopard is very fluid for them, and it is molded by Parsis and local villagers, how they relate with them. And through those intimacies, actually, they tell their stories relating with that. For example, sometimes they call as leopard as their jungle ka raja. Sometimes they term them as a kali parchaya too, when they kill too much livestock. Sometimes they term leopards as a soothsayer. Sometimes as a outsider too. Sometimes, as you said, pahadi baag is सीधा होता है, and then जो झू के प्यारे गुलदार होते हैं वो टेढ़े होते हैं. That again I have plenty of narratives with me. So the principle or important thing is that how do you think this is going to affect the conservation policies and governance when we consider those intimacies told by them? And then again, how one needs to address this uncertainties in leopard identities that is basically very fluid through ethnographic research.
Yeah, great. Mahesh, thank you. Great question. And we should definitely talk more. You're doing really important work around these oral histories. And I'd love to know how things are in Chamoli now. I've not been back for a long time. So yeah, do drop me a line. It'll be good to be in touch. I think the point you're making, especially about the conservationists and how do you sort of, you made two really important points, right? One is the fact that actually the very identity of the Bagh is constantly fluid, and you can't sort of you can't put it down to one thing, one character, one narrative. And the second point you made is like, how do you use these sort of shifting, slippery, very evocative identities? How do we allow them to be in conversation with the conservationists who in the current moment are actually sort of the dominant voices there, right? Whether they're working through the state or they're working through NGOs themselves or things like World Wildlife Fund, etc. I don't know. I mean, I think perhaps I'm going to keep coming back to the storytelling thing, that perhaps that's one way in which we can do it, that, that we, like, say, the oral histories you're collecting, if the ways to sort of write them up or to, I don't know, not just write them up, maybe have oral histories recorded or have visual representations of them or other ways in which you can sort of depict them and then sort of feed them back to the state and conservationist agencies, that might be one way to do it. I have tried a bit of it, not enough. Like, my book is now only coming out in India, I think next month or the month after. So I'm hoping to have some conversations with the forest department, in particular with people I've been working there with for a long time now, who are quite keen to see what I've written or whether it makes any sense, which I'm not sure it will to them. But perhaps another way to do it is through like more active collaboration with agencies of the state. But I have to say, it's very hard, right? Those kind of talking across spaces. But I mean, I think the kind of work you're doing is so important, and that would be a really, really important sort of knowledge forms for conservationists and agents of the state to sort of engage with. But yeah, I mean, I don't really have an answer here. I have to say the Storch network that we run, that I and my colleague from history, Amanda, run here in Oxford, that's one of the things we're really interested in. And one of the projects that we have is actually working with artists in Berlin and trying to have some sort of visual representation. So we have student artists at the Utica in Berlin. We're going this summer to work with them to try to think of some little exhibition or some sort of online platform or some sort of ways in which we're able to visually document or represent some of these the stories that you've been collecting as well. But I think you've really hit upon something when you say that shifting nature of the identity of the Bagh and that relationship with the Bagh is so central to the story, right? I mean, it is actually the story that you can't pin it down to one thing. And that's why for so long I really struggled with this, because there was it was so fluid and so ever-changing, exactly as you put it, that it becomes hard to pin it down in text in the traditional ethnographic way in which I think we're supposed to do it. But thank you so much for your question. And if you please do drop me a line, I'd love to talk to you more about your work.
Yeah, I think I will send you a mail later.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, please do. Thanks a lot for your question.
Fabulous. The the affordances of Zoom. Like we can focus on the positive. That's amazing. So Roderick, I see Roderick also has a question about storytelling that segues well into this. Roderick, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to kind of read it off? I guess I'll read it off. Okay, so so Roderick reports having spoken to multi-species scholars and is looking for different answers on how much. So the question is, how much of your work, i.e. the book, put the cat at the center of thinking, and how would one go about thinking from the non-human's perspective?
Yeah, great question. A really hard one to answer. I have to say, I've got stories about cats, but I don't really put them at the at the center of thinking per se. I'm focused on, the stories that people tell me about them, but I also then focus on materiality, and I focus on space a lot. Like, how does space become a way in which you can read off what a cat is doing or what a cat is like? I also focus a lot on social media and sort of new, as I said, the new ways of seeing. So through CCTV cameras, through WhatsApp, through YouTube videos, etc. So I have to say, I wouldn't know how to write from the non-human's perspective. So I wouldn't know how to write from the perspective of a tiger. I know some people have done it, not from a perspective of a tiger. Well, in fiction, there's a lot more space for that, right? So like you'll have, you get inside the mind of Sher Khan in Kipling's Jungle Book, or in some of the new sort of literature, animal writing or nature writing, there is much more from the non-human's perspective. I feel like I haven't had the courage to do that quite yet. But also I think my central question and the way I'm approaching it is coming more from the human side of it than the non-human's perspective. But again, I mean, it's a really important question. And I think, it is a question to all multi-species scholars. Where are you writing from, and whose work are you centering? Whose lives, whose words or worlds are you centering? putting at the center of thinking, as you put it, in it. But yeah, I have to say I'm very much on the human side. Sorry about that.
Great. Well, I can pick up with a question on that. Like as somebody who has dabbled in posthumanism and as I think maybe become more like staunchly kind of maybe writing from the perspective of the human, perhaps as a result. What your talk in the book does is and we're getting at that in some of the questions, is to think about the kind of the relationship between like ethnographic methods and kind of understanding or differently understanding climate crisis. And well, I mean, I really appreciate your kind of thoughts on the Anthropocene as analytic and what it opens up as opposed to perhaps what it forecloses. But I guess my question to you is to what extent, I guess it's two-pronged. About this kind of relationship between ethnographic methods and climate crisis. The first is about kind of the use and utility of emic concepts as a mode of kind of, or a means, especially an analytical means of doing that, that highlighting the uncertainty, highlighting contingency, and doing exactly, doing what you do so well in the book, which is this move from the normative forms of representation to the value of stories and kind of highlighting what you term as uncertainty. So kind of, like in crookedness being just a fabulous emic concept, for that. And then the second is slightly maybe more unformed in my mind, and it came at the very, very end of your talk. And it's this relationship, in terms of ethnographic representation between specificity, i.e. like the individual story, and kind of generalizability, right? Because like whether it's any scene, right? That's the kind of, right, the kind of intellectual hegemony of the scene is that like there's this totalizing kind of effect. Anthropocene, Plantationocene, Capitalocene, right? Like that there's a sameness.
Yeah.
And so like how, like, so what is it, like, how do we kind of attend to the political import as you kind of start with, and that kind of, right, we're not getting out of this anytime soon kind of totalizing kind ofness, and how do we understand that through individual kind of stories, and how do we kind of, anyway, so like how do we kind of like value ethnography in this kind of relationship between the individual and the totalizing kind of force of climate crisis, and then like what is the value of emic concepts? So yeah.
Brilliant, Sarah. Two brilliant sort of questions / comments. And actually, I mean, again, so much in conversation, our work, right, in so many ways. I think like the ways in which I've sort of dealt with it here is actually to weave these two together. So I really do focus on certain emic concepts, like the idea of Tedapan, the crookedness, because for me, I think that Tedabag really just captures something. It allows you to tell a different story in a way, but not just the idea of Teda, the ways in which, I mean, there are lots of these sort of emic concepts that I work through, which I think can be productive without it becoming just about that. So I think there's also this point where it can, you can sink so deep into that you're not able to then have the translation from, say, crookedness to collapse, or to like crookedness to the Anthropocene. Like, how do you make that? How do you put them in conversation? Your second point is such an important one, because actually that's something that to even sort of pick up on Roderick's point again, or to even with what Parijat was saying, is really something that I've sort of found useful is actually working through individual stories. So the introduction of the book is actually the life of this leopard in Gopeshwar, the one I first encountered back in 2006. And I say that every theme of this book has actually arisen from particular things that happened when she was haunting Gopeshwar. And so it's literally called Introduction, the Man-Eating Leopard of of Gopeshwar, not Rudraprayag, sorry, because the Crooked Cat of Gopeshwar, because I talk about, like, when she arrived, for instance, there was all this question, just as an example of, is it her? Like, how do we identify her? And there's a whole chapter on that. Then there were these petitions that were sort of written up around her. There's a chapter on that. There's this whole massive amount of theorizing on what made her crooked. Like, why is she crooked? And, we talked for hours and hours on that, as I'm sure Mahesh will also be sort of encountering right now in Chamoli, right? There was this constant narratives around that. So there's a chapter on that. So it's like, when I finished the book, I realized that the whole book was actually, I still went back to that Bag diary, those field notes I kept, and I wrote it through her life without maybe entirely knowing it, that I was getting interested in questions of how you see a big cat, how do you represent it? I was getting very interested in the question of space, because, that was one way in which we came to understand her. So the fact that she would go and hang around near the Shiva temple, the Gopinath temple in Gopeshwar, was one sign that, of her devoutness in some way, or like her relationship to Shiva and to that space, etc. And the conclusion is also the life of a tiger. It's this famous tiger called Avni, who was actually featured in the New York Times and Guardian. She was also called a man-eater in central India, was about the hunt and how they finally got her, etc. There's this film called Sherni, which is loosely based on Avni's life, that's come out with Vidya Balan as, this amazing forest officer. And again, I found the conclusion so interesting. I mean, the Avni's life, such an interesting and powerful way to actually speak about the things I was interested in, to be able to write about it in a way that I hope it also became interesting for other people. So I find this focus on individual lives, of the specificness of it, and then weaving out of that to make broader claims, whether it is about the Anthropocene or whether it is about petitioning practices and how they link up to older practices of the Mughal courts, for instance, and how that might seep into this idea of the darbar even today. I find that a one way to work through it. But they're really interesting. I mean, these are really great comments as ever, Sarah, and they really sort of come to the heart in a way of what I'm trying to do there.
It's super interesting. Thank you so much for that. And Natasha, and I think that like Nanika and I are the only people not outside right now.
I'm outside too. I wanted to show you a little bit of Ithaca. I'm on a jog and I just crossed Parijat actually on the way to class. So I had a question. Thanks for your talk. I had a question about, I wanted to pick up off of what you were saying about the boundedness of sites and how ethnography can challenge the boundedness of sites, and think about how we can also challenge the boundedness of national parameters and nations in our work. And I've been thinking about how, and you're thinking about state governance, how the governance of animals who are transboundary by virtue of just like not having to follow the same kinds of imposed borders that we as humans follow is an entry point to think about kind of blurring state parameters and national parameters. So in your work, did it ever come up, like either between states and India, kind of saying this is your governance issue, this is our governance issue, or yielding in collaboration, or between China and India or Bangladesh and India?
Yeah, great question, Natasha. Thanks. That came up all the time. And actually boundaries really play an important role here, because one of the, okay, it's going to get a bit involved, my answer, but hopefully it'll explain a bit of why the boundary is so important, the border is so important. So there's sort of two theories, very big theories on why big cats become crooked. One of them is that they're not sort of indigenous to the man-eaters. The crooked cats are actually not local. They're not Pahari cats. They're coming from the plains. And why would cats from the plains be up there in something like Chamoli? So something that people would often tell me up there is that, actually what the Indian state, and which is composed entirely of these Maidani, these plains people who are so against us anyway and are so neglectful and so like rapacious in this region, what they do is when these big cats become old or they become injured in the plains, they actually ship them up here to the borderland, right? So the whole idea is that Chamoli is, as I showed on the map, it's on the border with Tibet. And the idea is that this is just some vast, empty borderland which has no meaning, or it's only filled up with these savage Paharis, or who they don't care about. So they ship them up here and leave them there. And then these leopards and tigers actually do not have the wherewithal to hunt normal prey, because they've always been fed, prey, like food in the zoo or wherever they're coming from, the rehab centers they're coming from. And that is what leads them to attack humans, because humans are very easy prey for them. So that's one place where the border comes in quite a lot. But the other point where the idea of the border came up a lot was not so much between India and Nepal or India and Pakistan, as it does say with pigeons or yaks, for instance, which are thought of as spy animals. Was actually in the sense that, and this is something I've seen in Uttarakhand myself, is this question of translocation. So there's a lot of work, whether it's coming out of Kenya or Tanzania or of India, which shows that the moment you sort of start picking up quote unquote problem animals, and then you locate them elsewhere and you leave them there, these animals try to get even more violent. Like, so the conflict, so-called conflict, goes up dramatically as soon as you sort of move these animals away. What happens in Uttarakhand typically is, and I saw this happening during the legislative assembly elections, was that the BJP in power at the time, they were like, we don't want anybody to even see a leopard or a tiger, because there's such a big issue now, including an electoral issue now in Uttarakhand. So what you have to do is make sure that none of them are visible in my constituency. So what you had was the forest department on the sly picking up these leopards and putting them in cages and going and leaving them at other district borders, or out of the constituency, and leaving them there where there would be a spurt of conflict. So there's a particular study which has been done in Himachal in particular, where you look at how the highest amount of killings and attacks by leopards is happening on district borders, or on, not on district borders, but on the borders of the forest department. So, a particular division of the forest division, those borders, you can literally map it out and see that there's very high level of conflict there, of attacks on humans there, because of these state interventions where they're coming and picking them up and putting them in these horrible cages and going and dumping them there. So these were the ways in which the border came up a lot. And I think perhaps, the point you're making about my obsession with this disciplinary boundedness, I think part of it comes from my very profound sense that we can't understand crooked cats in India today if we do not engage with other forms of knowledge making. It just is not possible anymore, in a way that I did not feel with my earlier work on ethnography of law and bureaucracy. I felt like my deep ethnography within Chamoli and Gopeshwar was actually quite enough for me to be able to make wider arguments about Nareka and the nature of the developmental state and nature of welfare. Like, I didn't feel like somehow ethnography or this pure ethnographic narrative was limited in that book, but I definitely felt it here with Crooked Cats, that on its own will not suffice. But I think part of this also came from, really seeing, perhaps it came from this point of also seeing rail borders and seeing what borders do and, what happens in borderlands, or the ways in which there's certain things which happen in borderlands that are not written in, or that are not seen, that are invisibilized, but also they happen there because there are borders. And so maybe it's sort of it's a fight against borders of different forms, or different forms of boundedness. But thank you for your really great question. And thank you for listening while you're out on a jog. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's amazing. Are there any other, other questions or comments at this time? And it seems like everyone else in Ithaca is out enjoying this beautiful weather. Right, it's beautiful. It's like not even 50 degrees yet, but it's like, this is like pretty much like it's spring.
Gorgeous.
Oh, here I see one. Quinn, and there's one in the chat. Do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to? If so just maybe as one last question, I'm just going to take Quinn's question here. You alluded, Quinn notes that you alluded to being uncomfortable with the conservationist perspective. This discussion of the forest department and district boundaries seems like an opportunity to invite you to elaborate on this discomfort.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Quinn. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really uncomfortable with the conservationist work, largely because of sort of the anti-humanism which underpins it, especially when it comes to big cats. I think they're like that with most animals, but as soon as it becomes a charismatic megafauna like a tiger or lion, it's amazing to see it in practice, in terms of how their sole preoccupation is with actually increasing populations of endangered or animals, or like tigers and leopards and lions. And there's just a profound sense of, it's just naked in terms of how they don't actually care about the humans who live in the vicinity. They're just seen as disturbances or difficulties. I'm also very uncomfortable with the conservationist perspective. So, I think that's my profound problem with that. And to go back to the point Sarah was making about post-humanism, there's a way in which this is also a critique that we have of post-humanism, right? That it actually can be quite anti-human, or it can sort of not see the human in certain spaces. And that's where some of us have come back to actually centering the human in ways that perhaps we were trying to move away from in a bit in the beginning. So I think that's my critique of it. I'm also just really I find it really problematic the way in which the conservationist narrative and discourse overwhelms everything else, right? So there is by now a robust critique of sort of colonial accounts of hunting, of imperial masculinity when it came to sort of controlling nature, and to disciplining nature, etc. There's a very robust literature on that on South Asia, which is well known even outside history, etc. But I think that for me, the conservationist work is so dominant, despite the critiques that have come out of it, right? Of the draconian nature of some of these conservationist laws, the elitism of it, the urban class-based nature of conservationism, etc. It feels like it is not percolated down elsewhere. And so if you think of the forestry department, which really controls the lives of the cats in northern India, they're very much in thrall of these conservationist agencies, and they're actually very scared of them in terms of the kind of hue and cry some of this conservationists can make every time you sort of go near a leopard or a tiger. So that's my profound discomfort with it. But actually, I have many other discomforts we can talk about. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Well, great. Thank you again, Nanika, for just a really wonderful, fabulous talk. And I really, again, it's just with the ebullience of spring and going to a wonderful talk on a Monday morning. I mean, it's a good start to the week.